So welcome to the panel discussion for the 7th Early and Mid-Career Researchers Forum. We're delighted. We've asked our audience, our delegates who've been in Glasgow for the last day and a half, and we're delighted. We've had delegates from 18 countries from around the world, from as far apart as Pakistan, the United States, Australia, New Zealand, and lots of countries in Europe, and of course UK and Ireland. And what we plan to do with this session is, for the next, we've got a maximum of 40 minutes. And we've asked our delegates, so for those who are joining on Zoom and on Twitter, we've asked our delegates to submit questions, which I've got here. So we're hoping to get through quite a lot of the questions over the next 40 minutes. And they cover a whole range of topics, from questions really focused in on early mid-career trajectories and challenges, as well as specific questions on suicide and self-harm. And so those joining us on Twitter, I am Rory O'Connor, and I lead the Suicidal Behaviour Research Lab here at the University of Glasgow. And I'm delighted on the panel. I've got amazing colleagues. I've got Professor Amy Chandler, and Amy is a Professor of Sociology and Health and Illness at Edinburgh University. And I'm joined on my far left by Emeritus Professor Steve Platt, who's also affiliated with the University of Edinburgh, in which Steve and I work jointly as co-chairs of the Scottish Government's National Suicide Prevention Leadership Groups, the Academic Advisory Group, the co-chairs of that group. So welcome and thanks, Amy and Steve, for doing this. And so the plan is I'll start with the first question, and we'll try and organise it such that each of us starts the answer to each question, to our questions. We've got a bit of sort of continuity, equity, something like that. So start maybe then, Amy, with you first of all. So what's the best piece of advice for someone starting out on their PhD journey? And we've got this technical issue for those who are watching elsewhere of the sound. The sound keeps echoing. So Amy, fire away.
Okay, all right. So that's hopefully picking up and not making any awful noises. Best piece of advice, which is one that I had when I was a PhD student, was to enjoy having amount of time to do things, because you'll never get that ever again. And I was like, yeah, right, I've got loads to do. So yeah, spending that time reading, and connecting with people, but especially reading, because you'll never have so much time to read ever again in your entire.
Great answer. And actually, Steve, you made a similar comment to that this morning in your keynote.
Yeah. Being given the chance to spend time, even this was in a paid job, actually being allowed to go away and read up stuff and learn more about it in an intense way. Yeah, how do you? The thing about it though, I've realised, especially now working with colleagues in the AAG, with the Academic Advisory Group, is what might be the value of early researchers being exposed to doing some quick and dirty research and learning that there are different ways of doing research, and that sometimes it can't be perfect. In fact, a lot of the time it can't be perfect. So in the group, working on reviews around a specific question, which will then inform policy or practice, or both, and being told, well, we need that in 3 months, not 3 years. And I think the shock, my whole career, the first 12 years in this research unit were wonderful, but it was so divorced from translation, from practical and policy translation. It was a real shock later on, and I came to enjoy it. But I think that early exposure is not a bad thing, but it's so different to doing to the routine of doing a PhD. But I don't think it would be a bad thing if more junior researchers got the chance to do that.
Great answers. I suppose from my point of view, I think there's something around. I remember when I started out, and I went straight from undergraduate, from a taught program to a research program, a PhD program. And I think with an undergraduate program or a taught master's program, it's very structured, and you've very specific goals around assessment or exams. And I really struggled initially with going, how on earth am I going to make sense of this vast literature? So when I started my PhD, I wasn't quite certain what aspect I'm going to look at. Really, so a bit like Steve said this morning about in his first job having the 3 months to read. I think I did something similar. I just did loads of going to getting interlibrary loans, which back in the day, obviously, we couldn't just get them immediately on our computers. And then trying to make sense of the literature. And I felt really out of my depth. And then I thought I would never, ever understand the main issues. So, and I think that's a really healthy thing. And that's something which continues for all of your career. And I think I know a bit more than I did 28 years ago, or 29 years ago, or whatever it is. But you're always learning. So and don't worry about that. And then sometimes it manifests as imposter syndrome, and that never leaves you. And I think it's really, really healthy. Because the day you think you know it all and stop being concerned is the day you should stop. Okay, so that's question one. Thanks whoever asked that question. Then the second question, and I'll start this time with Steve. So Steve, and you touched on this earlier as well, some of this I think. But what has been the biggest challenge of your career, or the biggest hurdle or disappointment, or all combinations of the three?
I'm sorry, yeah, thank you. I think it was, well, I'll just say the first thing that springs to mind, which was that after 12 years in this research unit, and specialising research on suicide and self-harm, and the unit came to an end. And the director retired, and I tried to persuade MRC to support a small group, which they did then do at that time, which could continue the work in that area, but just with a few of us. And there's a side bit of this story, and I remember talking to the director, to Norman, about this. And of course, my main worry was, would I have the leadership, and would I have the intellect and all that? And he said, yes, that's not the issue. He said, the issue is dealing with senior staff with fragile egos, which I thought was absolutely brilliant. Anyway, the disappointment was that the proposal was turned down. They never even got to a formal proposal. They weren't interested. Unfortunately, at the same time, another unit, very similar unit, John Wing's social psychiatry unit in London, was also up for renewal, and there was no way they were going to do both. And of course, they went with the London unit, not the Edinburgh unit. So then I went, and it was great. I had a great experience working with Sally McIntyre, but it meant me switching completely. I did research, I didn't mention it earlier, research on sociocultural aspects of HIV and AIDS for 3 years, and then I moved on again. But the decision I made was to drop all suicide-related research. So at that point, I was leading the WHO multi-center study on parasuicide, which is a big deal. And I was one of the 4 team, and I was nominally the leader of that team, and I just said, no, the only way I can manage this is to pull out. And it was, I really regret having done that. It was a mistake. I could have easily. So there is that gap, and then I managed to find room. But for the rest of my career, I had to find room. I was doing other things to do what I really wanted to do. And now, since I've retired, I can do what I want to do. So that's fine.
Right.
I talked about these yesterday, so apologies. This is
well, for our wider Twitter audience. Oh.
I don't know why it's doing that. I'm so sorry. Okay. Right. Okay. So yeah, the biggest hurdle was the lack of stable contracts for the first 5 years of my career, and that not only was obviously personally very stressful, financially concerning, but one of the other things that I think I tried to allude to a little bit yesterday, but want to really just reaffirm here is just how much of an impact that had on what I was able to do with the research that I did do. So I have studies that are still, like the one that Steve and I worked on with general practitioners. Somebody was talking at some point in this conference about how annoying it is when studies get done and they don't get used. We had best practice guidance for GPs, and we just never managed to do anything with it because I was doing about 5 things at once and still didn't have a job. So yeah, I think that's one of the biggest things, and it's still that's one thing. But plus lots of other things I could have done. It was just like not have to spend more time trying to get another job. So
yeah, two great answers. I suppose mine, I'll go with biggest hurdle or challenge I've had in my career, and some people know that I think in 2008 I lost one of my closest friends to suicide, and that still remains really challenging for me because I just didn't know. I thought I left her family down and her down, and I didn't know whether I could continue working in the field, because literally, I think I've said this before, from almost every day since 1994, I have a very day passes I'm not thinking about suicide. And I just didn't know whether I could do that and continue to do that. So I think that's been the single most biggest challenge or hurdle that I've had to overcome. And I made a decision, I think hopefully the right decision, to stay working in the field, and it's not that. Some days I don't find it easy. Well, I think Claire, who died, I think she would think that's the right decision. And the other thing I did to help me manage that challenge, that hurdle, is talking about my own bereavement. And and I've done lots of public engagement stuff and documentaries and books and stuff. And the thing that people always come back to is not necessarily the brilliance of my research, which surprises me, but rather sharing those experiences. And I think that's been really, really powerful, but a challenge. Okay, so next question. I think I can start this one. So what is the one thing, I need to make glasses on. What is the one thing researchers can do to most increase our understanding of suicide risk? So that's another great question, so thanks for asking that. I suppose my answer to that would be, I think for too long, and I said a bit of this in the opening yesterday, I think for too long we've been too siloized, that the psychologists would do their thing, sociologists would do their thing, health economists would do theirs, and psychiatrists would do theirs, and we haven't done enough about learning across disciplines. We've been historically too focused on the sort of silos of our discipline, rather than being focused on what the key question is what are the best and most appropriate methods to help you answer the question you're trying to address, and in our case, to understand and then prevent suicide. And I suppose the way I address that now is that, so for me, to understand suicide, we have to understand properly the person in their social and cultural context. And really genuinely, and Steve touched on this in his presentation this morning, genuinely recognizing that no one of us has a right answer. No one of us should have our evidence prioritized over other forms of evidence. And I think we are moving in the right direction. But I think that would be the single piece of sort of what researchers should do to increase your understanding of suicide risk. So I think this time it's Steve.
Yeah, I think there's one thing having multidisciplinary teams, but beyond that, it's transdisciplinary, isn't there? Because how do we have, I think it's partly about how we have equal respect for all the different academic and other perspectives on the topic, and how we bring them together and integrate them into a coherent story about suicide. And I was thinking about that a lot in relation to my own keynote before, looking at the models and trying to how do we put together the teams that would actually move us to that position we all want to be in, of a truly integrated theory of suicidal behaviour. And I think some of the, and I'm the first to admit sometimes at certain areas of work in the field, I just find myself getting rather less than enthusiastic about it, let me put it that way. And then I stop myself and say, why is that? Is it my own bias? Let's look at this more objectively. What is it trying to say? Does it help us or not? But that kind of that transdisciplinary approach and mutual respect, I think we've still got a way to go.
Thanks. I had an answer to this, but now I might change it. But also I'm going to do two answers. Sorry. My initial thought, in terms in relation to what's the one thing you can do to increase our understanding of suicide, is to speak to people who have been affected by suicide in different ways, not just people who've lost somebody, not just somebody who may have attempted or thought about it. But I think speaking to people who are affected is one way, but obviously not the only way. And I think, I think the issues about kind of transdisciplinarity and multidisciplinarity, the importance of different perspectives, and thinking about how we better respond to and understand suicide is really absolutely important. But I think, I wonder if I'm going to gently push against Steve's suggestion about finding a kind of a coherent, integrated theory of suicide, and I wonder if that might be the wrong approach, and that actually accepting that there might not be one, and there may be many would be so.
Great, I think a bit of controversy there.
It doesn't happen often.
Is that right? No, I think it's a fair point. So, if you think of the field of suicide research, I think sort of related to that is, I think with this fallacy of prediction, right? So, will we ever be at a stage in which we can predict suicides on an individual level any better than chance, right? So I think as a field, I think we're moving towards, accepting that is a fallacy. It's a false it's an aspiration we won't achieve. But that doesn't stop us trying to better understand it, and both from an ideographic perspective, perhaps, as well as a non-aesthetic. And I think it's finding that balance of recognizing that I'm of the school that there are more commonalities than differences in understanding suicide risk. But I think we probably historically have we spent too much time where we haven't focused on the people who are in distress, the people who are bereaved, or the people who are suicidal. So I think we probably do still agree on that. I think. So yeah, trying to bring it into consensus, of course. Okay, so next question is we're back to Steve. Steve this time, I think, or is it Amy? Amy this time. Sorry. So how do you? And thanks for this question again. How do you sustain your well-being when working in this area? So how do you sustain your well-being?
It is a really good question. People that know me are smiling because they know what this is, and it's a really silly answer that I'm going to give. Things that keep me going is making sure I take breaks, which I do. I know I said that I work weekends this morning, but I do try not to do that. Going out on a bike, that's really helpful. And also finding fossils. I really like learning about totally different disciplines that I really don't understand, like paleontology, geology, astrophysics. And that's what keeps me going, actually, just doing something that has nothing to do with suicide at all. And it's, that's what's really helped a lot in the last few years.
Great, Steve.
Having quite a lot of children, grandchildren, that's quite hard, and it's only 7 grandchildren at the moment, but the youngest isn't just recently partnered, so we've still got a bit to go. I'm hopeful we'll get a few more grandchildren. Family stuff, photography, walks, exercise, the usual kind of range of things. I find I can get away with it, but I'm in a privileged position to be able to do that. But even then, and one of the reasons why I'm determined to pull back is because of finding, I went away earlier this year my wife and I, to do what, senior citizens do. They go and try and find some sun if they can afford it. So off we went to Tenerife for 4 weeks, and we had a lovely time. And while I was there, I thought to myself, why, before I went away, was I working 4 days a week? I don't want to work 4 days a week. I didn't retire 10 years ago to work. I don't need to do this. But then you have to make really, otherwise it just comes back, and it's so, it's such a, I've been, as I explained, that, working intensely for 12 years and then having to drop it, or feeling I should, but I've never been able to get away from the subject. It's both so distressing and personal and all those things, but it's also intellectually so challenging and interesting. It's an area, and I've worked in loads of other areas in public health, and there's nothing that comes anywhere near it in terms of the size of the challenge and the interest in it.
No fossils feature in my answers. No, I guess great idea. I suppose I'll answer it in 2 ways. One is, day to day, I suppose I've been fortunate over the years, and that's why I think this event is so important, is that the friendships and connections you make when you're doing your PhD in your early career are ones which will sustain you throughout your career. And so I've been very fortunate in that I've a really great network of colleagues and friends some of them working in the area and others not, but they understand the ups and downs of academia, but also understand particularly the emotive and challenging nature of suicide research. And also just being surrounded by, to embarrass my team, being surrounded by amazingly enthusiastic members of the Suicide Behaviour Research Lab really, really nourishes and helps me every day. So huge thanks to them who have to listen to me a lot. So that's the one bit of it. And then the other bit, I suppose, is the only place I don't ever think about, I can turn my mind off, is I love playing tennis. And when I'm playing tennis, if I'm focused on something else, I'll be really, really further. So that is really important, tennis and running, really, to nourish and support my mental health. Okay, next question is a very different sort of question. Is it, that was nearly a disaster. How do we improve population mental health as mental health researchers when the problems causing it are so often structural? So Steve, I think that is you this time. How do we improve population mental health as mental health researchers when the problems causing it are so often structural?
Become political, advocate. It's just, it is so shocking living in an era where the structures are so biased towards ill-being in every way, whether it's the global economic situation or the way the current government, for instance, has decided to respond, what will probably lead to a crash that doesn't need to happen in order that inflation comes to some figure that's acceptable. I mean, for many people this is just nonsense. I find myself, it's very frustrating knowing that these kind of structural deficits that have so much control then over and limit what can be done at any individual or collective level. And I really admire those people who kind of get stuck into trying to make a difference, and whether that's things like working with a political party or with a pressure group or with an NGO or with others in order to try and change some of those circumstances.
I think this is a really good question, so thank you to whoever asked it. But it is really tricky, and I don't know if there's much more of that from what Steve said, because all of those things I think are absolutely important. But I think also, like, if you are looking at population mental health, then you might be focused more on mental health, psychology, psychiatry, and so on. Is to reach out to other disciplines and other kind of people working in a more kind of political or structurally oriented way, and look at those connections and name them. So don't just leave them out, don't just control for them, name them, and because then, as I said yesterday, otherwise we are tinkering around the edges. It is important work, even if it is tinkering. But that makes it sound really terrible. It is really important work. But I think ultimately, there's so many things happening, like politically, that just make things worse and continue to. And I think if we're not talking about those things, then it gets really depressing. And it's like, what's the point of doing this, actually, if we're not raising the larger issues as well as doing the other work as well?
So I agree with that. I suppose the two bits I would add is, I think we do have, three of us sitting on this panel are in a very privileged position that we do have influence. And in Scotland, for example, we're very fortunate. We're heavily involved in the development both of the suicide prevention and the self-harm strategies and action plans. And indeed, as part of, I was credit Steve. Steve's, ever since I've known Steve, he's always talked about we have to tackle inequalities. Inequalities, inequalities, and inequalities. And in the new suicide prevention strategy published last September in Scotland, we've got reducing suicide and the inequalities that lead to suicide. And so I do think that we can make a difference. And I then think about what my sort of president of the International Association for Suicide Prevention hat is on. We try and address some of these structural issues. So, for example, our wider, huge issues. So, for example, last year, we did a lot of advocacy work around trying to decriminalise suicide across the world. In too many countries, suicide remains a criminal offence. And So we're trying to really intervene at that government level. And we've also developed support strategic documents and guidance, and Steve's been heavily involved in this actually, again in the work with YAS, in terms of helping governments to develop and implement suicide prevention strategies, which are obviously clearly involve tackling the structural inequalities, discrimination, and so on. And actually, the last thing I'd say is, again, if I think about COVID, so COVID and beyond COVID, so I, again, was very fortunate to be involved in setting the research agenda for how we prioritize and protect mental health during COVID. We worked with MQ, the Mental Health Research Charity, and the Academy of Medical Sciences. We put together this position paper, which we published in 2000, at the height of COVID 2020. At the heart of that, we're tackling inequalities, tackling these structural issues. And then since that, we've also published a piece led by Mark Senior in Canada on really what governments can be doing to tackle the cost of living crisis, how we can put safety nets in place. And then lastly, just a couple of weeks ago, again, in conjunction with MQ Mental Health, I co-led this group of people, 40 people from across the world, from 5 continents, and what we're trying to do is identify what we can do to prevent premature mortality associated with mental illness and mental distress. And again, we look at that, what we were able to do was really prioritize structural inequalities, so discrimination, inequalities, stigmatization, gender violence, any form of discrimination, that all featured really, really heavily. So I think we can do more of that, but we probably haven't done enough. Okay, so the next question is, again, a very different question, but a very important one, is, so how do you consider the value of third sector or non-academic research against academic research? Steve? No, it's me, isn't it? I think I get a bye doing it. I think that's a great question because, again, when I started out in this area 20 odd years ago, I don't think non-academic research was valued in the way it should. But I think as in the intervening period of time, that has changed, and actually most systematic reviews now, especially for real world problems, especially looking at solutions to problems like challenge and suicide, you try to incorporate, and you should be incorporating the grey literature as we would describe it. And that includes obviously work conducted by the third sector organisations. The third sector organisations are amazing, and I work very closely with them in Scotland and elsewhere, but the work not only in driving forward the research agenda, like in terms of the policy and advocacy work, that's so central to getting change at government level. So I certainly value it very highly, and but we again, and as I said previously in the previous question, we still have some distance to go. But I think we have methodologies to better incorporate that.
I'll just briefly yeah, I totally agree. I think the work anyway, research that's done by third sector organisations, because I mean it's often much more agile than we're able to be as academics, which is something that I really, really value. And it's based on a much more in-depth knowledge of what's happening on the ground. And I think a lot of the work that we do wouldn't be possible in the work that I do with my team without good collaborations with third sector organisations. It would be impossible. And so, yeah, I think there is indeed probably a way to go, but I think more collaborations would probably help in both ways. I think one of the things that I worry about is that, as Rory said, the so-called grey literature is often, it is more likely to get incorporated into reviews and so on, but it does so often just not get, this is not there in the searches that we're usually doing and relying on. So I think a lot of knowledge gets lost, and that's a bit of a shame. But, I think we could do more.
Yeah, great.
Yeah, I don't think I've much to add except the need, some academic NGO collaborations, they can come under stress because of the expectations that the academics might have about what constitutes proper research. I know I sort of touched on it before, so there are, courses for courses, it's research that's required in certain circumstances where good enough is good enough. And and being respectful of that is really important.
Great, thanks both. So the next question is a very specific question, and so I'll answer briefly because it's a very straightforward answer, I hope, to it. So the question is, how can early career researchers from the global south ever have equal footing with peers from the global north when all major suicide prevention conferences events are held in high-income countries with restricted visa regimes and unfavorable currency exchange? Really, really important question. Really important question. Again, with my International Association for Suicide Prevention hat on, that's something we are very conscious of. And so when we're organising our biannual World Congress, we try and alternate it from, broadly speaking, the global north and the global south. But again, and we try and structure the fees we've obviously different zones for the fees. But I agree that most suicide prevention conferences do not cater for the global south. And given that if we don't even think about global north-south, but low middle-income countries, almost 80% of all suicides are low middle-income countries, but we're not holding research conferences necessarily in those areas. So I think that's something we as an organisation are very conscious of, and it's something I'll also bring back to the International Association or International Academy for Suicide Research, which I'm also a board member of. Do you want to add anything else?
I wouldn't add anything, but I think it's a really, really important question. But it's like there isn't a great answer for it, I think, as well. I think making moves towards it. Making moves towards it is great, but I think there are just like visa issues, money issues, resource issues, and I think I wonder if something much more radical might be needed. Or I'm not sure.
So I can widen this a little bit, if that's okay. I mean, not thinking about conferences, but I was reflecting on the program that Rory mentioned that I'm involved in for YAS, but Internet Partnerships for Life, which is basically trying to extend the number of countries that are undertaking suicide prevention, both kind of projects and programs, but more importantly are developing whole national strategies and implementing them. And one of the striking things has been up to now how difficult it is in the whole of the African region. I forget how many countries that is. But we now, under this program, we have a coordinator for each of the 6 world regions using the WHO region. So there is a colleague, Joseph Safo, who is undertaking that work in Africa. And in a relatively short period of time, with kind of just a little bit of support from YAS, has galvanized a number of people. Ghana has a new association for suicide prevention. They're also decriminalising, I think, and so on. Things are happening, and I'm not saying it's not all caused by the program, but just with that kind of support and recognition, and bringing them into the fold, and stop saying, well, we can't do anything in a whole continent. That's not acceptable. So that I think that extending the hand of friendship and providing some very, very meagre resources, but necessary resources, you can make quite a difference.
No, thanks, Steve, for winding up that question. Okay, we've probably time for, 2 last questions. We have about 5 minutes remaining. So a good question here. Can you share advice for early career PIs or faculty members on how you approach mentoring young people, in particular undergraduate young people who want to get involved in suicide research? So how do you mentoring advice, I suppose, for young people? Undergraduates.
Okay, I have not mentored many undergraduates who are wanting to work in this area, so I guess I should preface that with that. I have worked with quite a lot of master's students who are interested in working in the area and often bringing their own. I work in a department where we do counselling studies, and I'm often looking at quite small qualitative in-depth studies, and then often bringing their own experience. And so I suppose one of the things that I have to necessarily prioritise when working with them is making sure that they're supported and they're thought really carefully about all of the things they need to put around themselves to to maintain their well-being, to be aware of the challenges of working in this area, especially when you've got lived experiences of what you're studying. So give them time, space and introducing them to other networks to get that kind of mutual support, I guess, especially for undergraduates and the master's students I work with as well, would otherwise be one of only a few people working on suicide in a bigger cohort of students where they're not doing stuff that's perhaps quite so challenging.
Stacey?
I can't think of a single, I don't think I've ever been in a position in relation to an undergraduate. It's 10 years now since formally, doing things like, being your supervisor. So I don't know if I've got anything really to add to that, I would say.
Well, at least you're honest, Steve. I think the only thing I agree that so in the approaches I get and had over the years, it's again, lots of people with their own lived experience, and of course their own interest in mental health or suicide or self-harm. And it's maybe just thinking through the emotional load on the individual. But for me, I think the number one thing is, and I often say this, is so yeah, I'm there as a supervisor. My aspiration is to get you to a PhD, but safely. And I always say the number one priority for me is your well-being. Your PhD always comes second to your well-being. So I think it's as long as the person is aware of the supports available, and I'm very fortunate group of people. We did a lot of peer support, of speaking to each other, others working in the same area. So I think that would be the clearest advice I would give. And and just being upfront with this will be challenging, and so people going into it with a clear understanding. And then the other thing I would say is just recognizing that just take time. I try and promote autonomy so that it's the person that pays the subsequent master's or PhD student buys into it's their project. It's not my project, and it's really ensuring that ownership. And so the other piece of advice is that so at the end of the 3 or 4 or 5 years, that when people think about a topic, you're the go-to person. What is your unique selling point? I suppose that's what I would do. Okay, so the very last question, you don't know this one, so you'll like this. So if you had £10 million, somebody gave you £10 million for suicide prevention, what would you do with it? So I'm going to give Amy a bit more time to think of that. Steve,
Do you mean
to do anything at all? Research or policy or private? 10 million.
10 million? I've got what a failure of imagination on my part. I don't think it's money won't buy what that's the problem. So I'm not trying to avoid the question, but to me it's not a money thing. Rory's already alluded to the fact that there is this emphasis, for instance, in Scotland, in the new strategy on inequalities. And there is a commitment to a whole of government approach, a whole of society approach, and all the right things are said. But there is no mechanism to make sure that the whole of government approach will actually be fully implemented. And that's not a money thing, that's about getting what I call the architecture of suicide prevention strategy delivery in such a way that you bind in all the various, say, government departments and leading and national NGOs with clear commitments and ability and the requirement that they have to come face to face with their peers in other departments and NGOs and be held accountable for what they've said would be done under that strategy. And that's basically the what goes on in Ireland as far as the blueprint. So there is a cross-sectoral group. It does contain all the right departments. They do get regular reviews of what's going on and review it, and that held to account. It does report to a cabinet subcommittee. But I'm not naive enough to think it all works fine. In fact, there's going to be an evaluation next year, and we'll see how well it's been working. But at least the architecture gives it a chance. In Scotland, we don't have that, and I've raised this, and I think it's a huge deficit, but that's not a money issue.
Amy?
I agree with Steve on that one. I think it's a key issue, and actually, if I could do something, it would be something that would be priceless and politically unpleasant. So I'll see the things that I have got an answer though to what would I do if I actually just had 10 million at all. Is that I would distribute it through the network of people who work in the third sector or local government that are tasked with suicide prevention roles, but often don't have very many resources through which to do that work. So I would give it to them.
Thanks for that both. I suppose mine would be, no, except of course you try and get magic away inequalities. Of course I would do that. But I think if a 10-minute on a research side context, I think we've good evidence for lots of things, right, being effective. So in terms of psychosocial treatments, there's evidence that they work. But if you went to try and get access to them, you don't. So I would try and prioritise the implementation of the evidence base that we have already. And that both is in the context of psychological treatments or psychosocial treatments, also in terms of access to mean stuff, in terms of other interventions we know are effective. So for me, that would be my 10 minutes, but I totally accept what everybody, my fellow panel members have said. Okay, so it just remains for me to thank all of you for submitting your questions. Great questions, very wide-ranging questions. And thanks to those on Twitter and on Zoom for joining us. We only have the one microphone, as you can see, and it's technically challenging, but hope you find that helpful. And again, thanks everybody, and enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.